So I'm actually a biologist by training, and I came to UC Davis as a new faculty member in 2006. But around 2010, I got interested in trying to carve out some time to put more into educational outreach and ethical and policy issues. And so for that reason, around 2010, I started a blog that allowed me to sort of talk about stem cells, regenerative medicine. And Robin did a great job introducing what regenerative medicine is all about, and in fact, some of the ethical issues that I'm going to touch on as well. So thanks to Robin for that. You can learn more about my lab's research. I've got a website, chromatin.com. The blog itself, called The Niche, is at ipsl.com, and I'm also on Twitter. Then also, as another way to do educational outreach, I recently started a YouTube channel, and so I've just put a screenshot here. And unfortunately, on YouTube, there's not a lot of sort of data-centric stuff or content in terms of talking about stem cells and regenerative medicine. So I'm trying to sort of bring an addition from sort of more of a scientist perspective. So Robin also touched on some of the emerging challenges that I've got in this slide. And so I won't go into too much detail on these. These were mostly things that I had hoped I would have time to talk about, but don't. So I'm really just going to talk about the first thing, which is this problem that we have, which is premature commercialization, I guess I would say, of stem cell and regenerative medicine products, and how this is starting to move in a concerning direction where it seems that some universities are getting more involved in marketing of not yet FDA approved biologics. So those of you who have spent some time in biology class or biochemistry class, oftentimes you might have seen something like this or be familiar with this, like you have to memorize these biochemical pathways. I certainly did. But within the stem cell field, things have gotten so complicated that there's now this thing that I'm calling the ecosystem, which also has sort of all these different nodes and arrows and things that it's kind of as complex as a biochemical pathway. So in the stem cell ecosystem, I've put patients at the center here in green, and just focusing on the top portion for the time being. What's in red is just sort of the traditional academic component of this. You know, you have university labs, funders, journals, different societies. There's the biotech side to this. There's also in yellow more governmental and institutional bodies like the FDA, Health Canada, other organizations. There's also clinicaltrials.gov. So this is the top part of this has been pretty consistent for, I guess I would say, a decade or more. You know, obviously things evolve a lot. But what's happened is there's now this sort of new constellation here at the bottom, which is what we're calling these stem cell clinics. And these clinics now are so ubiquitous, both in the US, especially in the US, but also there are some in Canada as well, that they've also now started to sort of form in their orbit or in their own sort of pathway, many sort of associated businesses that in some ways are problematic as well. And so you can see some of these other things sort of circling around here, including clinics setting up their own IRBs, and IRBs are institutional review boards, as many of you know, are supposed to oversee research. The clinics have their own societies kind of in parallel to the academic or other kinds of societies up here. So there's definitely some sort of echoes back and forth, like clinics will set up their own journals that are sort of in parallel to the journals that we sort of tend to go to in the more academic field, and so on. And so the presence of this, again, I guess I would call it like a clinic node or constellation down here, has really warped or changed this stem cell and regenerative medicine ecosystem. And so now I would say the public and the media that I've got over here on the right side, how they're viewing our field is very largely shaped, unfortunately, in part by this stem cell clinic constellation over here. So I think that's really problematic. And as I'll go into later, I think some of the clinic sort of philosophies of how we should approach things have rubbed off on some universities, it seems. And so there's some added complexity there. So just briefly, what I wanted to kind of talk about what actually is an unproven stem cell clinic. So this is a location. It could be in a strip mall. It could be you know, a larger facility that sells different kinds of stem cell or other kinds of cellular therapies, in quotation marks. Oftentimes, if they are marketing stem cells, evidence suggests these are not really stem cells. In some cases, not really even cells. So there's a lot of variability there. Importantly, there's no generally there's little to no data to support what they're selling. The therapies in question are not approved by regulators, and these businesses often make misleading or even outright false claims about potential benefits, and low or absent safety risks is something that they often claim. So unfortunately, these clinics, and this is work by me and Lee Turner, and we've collaborated on a few different projects over the years. So this is work kind of charting the history of the emergence of this stem cell clinic industry over time. And so what we did is we were able to kind of go back using internet archiving and data mining. And each of these little pegs, red pegs, is a stem cell clinic in the US. And what you can see is going from 2008, when none of them were advertising on the internet, and it seemed that there were only maybe 2 or 3 in the entire US. By 2016, there were more than 500 of these clinics. And so obviously this is a major problem, as I was defining these clinics previously, because they're sort of outside the sort of standard norms of what we think of as a regenerative medicine kind of therapy. Now, in the past 5 years since we published that paper, it seems Lee has been sort of continuing to keep track of this. It seems like the presence of clinics that you see on this map in 2016 has doubled again. And so you can imagine how many more of these pegs there are on this map. There's many clinics in Canada, and you guys are probably more aware than I might be of how Health Canada and other groups have been trying to address that issue. So this really almost came out of nowhere over a relatively short period of time. As far as I know, I don't know of any other sort of biomedical phenomenon that has emerged this quickly and sort of taken regulators by surprise in any kind of scope, even outside of stem cells and regenerative medicine. So this is really sort of an unprecedented phenomenon. Part of the explanation for how we got to this situation now, where basically every metro area in the US has multiple stem cell clinics competing with each other, and people can drive instead of flying to another country to get these unproven therapies, was that unfortunately the Food and Drug Administration here in the US was kind of slow out of the gates, I guess is one way to say it. And so some of us like Lee and I, Lee really was a leader in this area, and I also worked really hard to basically engage with the FDA and make them aware of this problem. Well before 2016, when we published that article that finally quantified the clinics, Lee and I were talking to the FDA. Sometimes there was no response. Sometimes there was a little bit of a response. We would talk to journalists, and they would publish articles about the problem. But unfortunately, it wasn't really until 2016 or 2017 when you remember that map, when already there were hundreds of these clinics, that the FDA kind of started getting moving. And so this bureaucracy, and again, I don't know what other reasons might have led to their slow response. Maybe, again, the speed of the emergence of this clinic industry caught them by surprise. But anyhow, they were very slow to get going on this, and the clinics definitely took big advantage of that. The good news on this is that today the FDA, I think, is doing a much better job, at least relatively speaking. There still are perhaps 1,200 of these clinics just in the US alone, but the FDA is starting to really push back. And so I've just listed here some examples of what the agency's been doing. They've sent 500 of what they call untitled letters to different clinic firms in the US. And that's really a huge number. Again, this may be sort of an uncharted territory in terms of the FDA doing something of this kind of scope for anything, sending out 500 letters to an industry. These letters are not very substantial or weighty in terms of actually what may come next at a legal level, but they basically are telling the clinics that we're aware of you, we feel that you're non-compliant, and basically you better shape up, was the kind of thing. The gist of it. Only a handful of these letters actually were posted to the public domain by the FDA, so it's not clear why those out of 500. So we just have sort of had to read the tea leaves from those. At a larger level or more weighty level, the FDA actually filed suit through the Department of Justice against 2 different clinic firms on opposite coasts. So in Florida, the FDA actually has been victorious in a lawsuit, getting a permanent injunction against a clinic firm there that was linked to the blinding of at least 3 patients. There's a parallel case here in California where I am that has been sitting with a judge, I think, for 7 weeks. So trial's done. So I think any day now, I'm thinking probably something like next week, we may get a decision on that, which I think in some ways this California case may be more important because one of the defendants is an entire chain of like 100 clinics. And so I believe the verdict, the injunction would actually apply to them should the FDA prevail. Just by way of disclosure, I actually testified in that case for the FDA. And it was interesting. I was able to also watch some of the case on Zoom. And it was just fascinating seeing the clinics, clinic people kind of defending what they were doing. Seeing, the sort of back and forth in court was something that was a little bit newer to me. Very hard to read the judge. I don't know what's going to happen in terms of the verdict that he will come down with. The FDA has also issued more of what are called warning letters. So these are more serious. They oftentimes, I think almost always, come after an in-person inspection of a firm. And so the FDA has issued more of these. They also have been really much better about coordinating with other government agencies, which I think has really empowered them together to do more good. So I'm talking here about the FTC, which regulates like false claims by clinics, the CDC, NIH. So that's all been pretty encouraging. Well, we also have a better sense now of the harms that have happened to patients. I mentioned people losing their vision. There's also been this one explosive case where an umbilical cord product that was contaminated with E. coli and other pathogens was distributed by a very aggressive marketing firm called Livion across 8 states in the US. Here's a headline in the Washington Post about it. At that point, we only knew about 5 states and 12 cases of infections. Now a new paper I'll show you in the next slide has helped us better understand that. We also know some patients who go to these clinics get unusual immune system events that are very serious. You can get scarring from injections of different kinds of cells. And there are a wide variety of other adverse events that are really important. Some of these include deaths that really seem to possibly be due to the clinic interventions, but just somehow never were really investigated properly. So in terms of this big recent case by Livion, this marketing firm, just this week, the CDC has a new paper out in one of the JAMA journals that I've included a screenshot of here. And basically they did an epidemiological study and they were able to find that instead of 12 patients, it actually was 19 people who were hospitalized. One person was infected who didn't need to be hospitalized. And so this was a much more serious outbreak than was originally realized. It was very fortunate because this firm was sending out these hundreds of vials, I believe, across the country. And so this actually could have been much worse. I also believe this kind of highlights how the clinics sometimes use substandard cell processing materials. There was another case of a firm that got dinged by the FDA in a report for just basically using a sort of kitchen level standards for prepping cellular materials like just kitchen cutting board and things like that. So just to transition a little bit, I think another level of harm here has been to the stem cell and regenerative medicine field more generally. So obviously we're really concerned if patients are getting harmed, but I think the field itself can get harmed as well. So the public often views stem cell research, unfortunately, through the lens of clinics. If we have 1,200 or so clinics just in the US alone, and then we have all the associated other firms, marketing firms, IRBs, these sort of substandard journals, et cetera, there's a huge amount of information that they can put out and that gets out to the public. Some of this comes through unexpected things like Joe Rogan has had a few different episodes about stem cells that have had like millions of views, where I was really concerned about the content there. It really seemed promotional almost for clinics. So I think the public gets this sense of stem cells in part, because of what the clinics are saying and their people associated with them, and that kind of reflects poorly on the field overall. And then, as I mentioned earlier, it seems that some universities and medical groups, it almost feels like they're getting into sort of the swing of things in terms of the philosophy of some of the clinics. And that's where I'm going to kind of transition to now and give you 2 sort of case studies. So, so again, just to kind of remind you, here's maybe this is me as a scientist, this is how I view the stem cell field because I'm sort of trained to think about all these biochemical pathways. But again, I think what we're talking about here is these clinics, this constellation here, influencing other components of this ecosystem. So the first case is sort of a retrospective, and this is something I first sort of starting doing research on in 2017, maybe even 2016. And I kind of made this flow chart. Again, I guess I'm a flow chart person. And so just by way of introduction, Northwestern University had a hematopoietic stem cell autoimmune disease program. So the idea here was if you have an autoimmune disease, your own immune cells, are attacking your tissues. So the idea is to use chemotherapy to ablate or kill part of the immune system, give the patient back their own blood stem cells and kind of reboot the system, and hopefully in a way that is not so autoreactive. So clinical trials were ongoing at Northwestern. And there was something unusual about these clinical trials as compared to most. And that is that there was actually marketing associated with these clinical trials. And so some of the marketing actually implied that there was already a cure, although at the time, if I remember correctly, these were just like phase 1 clinical trials or phase 2 clinical trials. So I would say some exaggeration or hype was going on here. Another really unusual component, especially at that time, was that in order to participate in the clinical trial, oftentimes you as a patient had to pay, and you had to pay a lot of money, $100,000, $150,000. Some patients were fortunate in that they had insurance that covered this, which was interesting that the insurance carriers were okay with that. But other patients had to go on GoFundMe. So here's sort of another component. They often would release their health information in order to sort of come up with a compelling fundraising campaign. And you could sort of say in a way they were kind of coerced to do that because they had to pay this fee. On this other side, of course, there are patients, maybe they didn't have health insurance or didn't cover it. So is it ethical that they basically were excluded from this because they weren't able to pay to sort of access the clinical trial? So the clinical trials themselves were ongoing. The team was also treating patients off study through compassionate use. So there's sort of these parallel things going on, a clinical trial and basically infusions of this or treatments with the same kind of approach off study. And I feel like there's a lot of complexity and challenges to this kind of off study work. Oftentimes, if things go wrong, this data does not actually get included in papers, for instance. The clinical trials themselves, unfortunately, had some non-compliance issues as well at Northwestern. And this led to an FDA warning letter. And in part, this warning letter was actually due to a failure to promptly report patient deaths. And that's obviously a huge concern because if some patients are dying in some of these trials, it's really important that the FDA know about that. And unfortunately, further research that I've done suggests there's actually been more patient deaths that we're not really aware of because the team's papers did not include those patient deaths. They were somehow excluded. So at the time I made this flowchart in 2017, this trial was still ongoing. On the positive side, some of the results were actually encouraging. And this may actually be a legitimate way to treat patients with multiple sclerosis. The actress Selma Blair went through this same program, and I think she's doing pretty well. So that's somewhat encouraging. But it's sort of a charging kind of model, and a model where there's marketing and I would argue some kinds of hype involved, maybe not entirely appropriate disclosures going on. So I found this kind of model to be very concerning. And it's a little bit more similar to the sort of stem cell clinic kind of model where you charge, you promote what you're doing. I should note one major difference is that all of what this kind of program at some point had to have gotten FDA approval in some kind of way. I don't know if the agency revoked that at some point. And ultimately, kind of where we are now is that Northwestern University shut this entire program down, even though the data were very encouraging, with no real explanation. So we don't really know what was really going on behind the scenes. The trials were terminated. And so unfortunately, again, many data points will never be published probably. So we're kind of stuck with trying to better sort of try to grasp with what this all means without all of the information. So that's one case. And there's another case that is actually still kind of ongoing now, and I think raises sort of unique concerns. And this is a Duke pediatric cord blood program for autism, cerebral palsy, and potentially some other conditions. So this is a little bit of a different situation. We have pediatric patients, which can raise unique ethical issues. Also, this team had published their work earlier than the Northwestern team. And interestingly, the Duke team's own trial results that they've published were pretty mixed for cerebral palsy and actually negative for autism. The work found there was really no benefit. But interestingly, they've continued on with this, and they have what's called an expanded access program, or EAP, which is kind of also known as a compassionate use program. So again, they're doing trials and parallel sort of off-study things, which is similar to Northwestern. Another similarity is that they're charging for this. And so if you want your child who has CP or autism to participate, you have to pay $15,000 or so. The price is sort of changing per infusion with cord blood cells. And so things are sort of fuzzy with this. Again, with these compassionate use programs, oftentimes the data is not published. But to my best knowledge, about 500 children have already gotten these infusions through the compassionate use program, again, in parallel to the clinical trials. And so if you multiply 500 times $15,000, that's a big amount of money. I think that's $7.5 million. Based on their own data, just my own assessment of things, I think there's really a low chance of benefit because of the discouraging data. We're also sort of starting to learn now more about the potential risks here. It's sort of coming out further that a number of the children who are getting these infusions through the compassionate use program actually are being sedated in order to give them the infusion. And so for these very vulnerable kids, you can imagine sometimes traveling across the country, going to a new place, like a hospital kind of setting. There's needles, there's doctors, and so all of that combined with sedation, it really can be hard on these kids. And unfortunately, I feel like some of the marketing material that we're seeing is kind of potentially giving these families false hope. So that's kind of where we were at last year. And now this year, there's sort of been an acceleration of this program. The Duke team has signed a huge deal with a biotech firm called CryoCell. That's a cord blood banking firm. And CryoCell now wants to become a stem cell treatment firm in addition to a banking firm. So as part of this deal, Duke and CryoCell want to open infusion clinics. So these are sort of direct-to-consumer kind of clinics based on the compassionate use program. And this one or more clinics would open within just a few months from right now. Again, they would probably charge around $15,000, maybe 10 to 15, it's sort of a little vague. And some of their marketing materials suggest that they're targeting perhaps thousands more children as what I would say almost now become customers, because this is not a clinical trial. This is a compassionate use kind of program. You have to pay to participate. And so we're kind of left at this point where I'm wondering whether or not the FDA will allow this to continue. The FDA actually, again, had to approve the initial expanded access program at some point. I've called on the FDA through my blog and actually just directly talking to them to sort of take a closer look at this, take a closer look at the plans. Again, this clinic here, this is a for-profit, publicly traded firm. I looked at their SEC documents, and basically this deal is all about being commercial, in my opinion. And the sort of spirit of the EAP program is not commercial. So I feel like there's some serious concerns there. Now, on the other hand, I presented pretty assertively one sort of side of this, but let me sort of give you a little bit on the other side, just to kind of have some balance and be fair. And part of this comes from patients at Northwestern, especially reaching out to me as I was critical of that program. And I really learned a lot from talking with those patients. So on the positive side, these programs give patients early access to new approaches, right? And especially in the Northwestern case, some of those autoimmune diseases that were being treated, they looked like they were going to be terminal. Many of the patients have reached out to me and said they basically feel like their life was transformed, they were saved. And so that combined with the encouraging data in the Northwestern case and from other universities, it's complicated. It's not totally simple. And I think some of these people probably were actually greatly helped by this program. And many patients' families want that kind of access. They want that kind of opportunity, especially with very serious illnesses. And talking with the patients, in fact, with some of the people involved in some of these things, requiring the money from the patients basically makes the access possible because the groups just don't have enough funding. And I believe for both the Northwestern and the Duke cases, they didn't have current NIH funding, for instance, to run their trials. So there really are kind of two sides to this. I hope I'm not engaging in like false balance. I really do think there are two sides to this. It's more complicated than just sort of black and white, but you can kind of probably guess how I feel. I feel pretty strongly that there's reasons for concern here. Finally, just to kind of start wrapping up, I think COVID has added some real complexity to the cell therapy field. In my opinion, I think the FDA had, during the Trump administration, approved too many INDs. These are sort of okays to start a clinical trial kind of thing. And unfortunately, quite a few of the INDs were actually from stem cell clinics, which is interesting. And I've seen some evidence that some of the clinics may actually be using these cleared INDs as a way to sort of help allow them to kind of charge some patients. And in one particular case, one of the most famous stem cell clinics is called Celtex down in Texas. And they have this really great ally in Rick Perry, who went on Fox News to actually promote Celtex and just kind of the idea of cells for COVID, which is a really complex area. And finally, we still don't have an acting FDA commissioner, unfortunately, here in the US. There was news that Robert Califf, who was past FDA commissioner, may become FDA commissioner again. I think having a permanent commissioner would probably help the FDA in moving forward. So last slide, just kind of thinking about wrapping up, looking to the future. My understanding is that there are actually several other universities charging for hematopoietic stem cell therapies that are not fully approved as drugs by the FDA. So I'm a little bit concerned that charging for clinical trials may become the norm. Let's see how I'm doing on time. And so for me, I think charging for a trial, kind of pay for play as it's sometimes called, really raises a lot of complexity, especially if there is associated marketing. I remember as a kid, one of my older brothers had a friend who would trying to raise money. So he would participate in studies and he would get like $100 or $200 for being a participant. And now things have really flipped around where sometimes you're having to pay as much as $150,000 to get into a trial. It's not entirely clear how the FDA decides whether it's going to approve charging for unproved therapies. I wonder if perhaps we can change how they think about these things, kind of the system that they go through to decide. I want to also mention just real briefly, there are programs called patient-funded research programs that are somewhat different in a lot of cases, and some of them are just wonderful. And I wanted to highlight one called Summit for Stem Cell that's down in Southern California for Parkinson's disease. And one of the amazing things about this program is that the patient advocates are leaders in this program. And so they're involved in the decision-making. And many of them actually themselves, it looks like just based on sort of the time course of how the research is progressing, will probably never benefit themselves. They're not trying to get some kind of, unproven therapy right now. They're really sort of paying it forward. And so I think that particular program is a great example of how patient engagement can really be wonderful. And finally, just kind of thinking ahead about this, what I would call sort of the stem cell clinic problem, however we want to name it, because oftentimes it's not really just stem cells, it's other things like exosomes, et cetera. Where are we going to be in 5 or 10 years? I think trying to look ahead is so important in this area just because things can change so quickly. And I think a lot of us sort of didn't realize early enough that we were in the midst of sort of an exploding problem earlier on. I don't actually know. It's hard to predict where we'll be in 5 or 10 years, but I think I have a little more optimism that we might be in a better place than I might have had a year or two ago. So I'll try to kind of end on that optimistic note. And I think I'll go ahead and stop and we can take questions.